Bashlin climbers, shaping and sharpening pole gaffs. To correctly sharpen and maintain the shape of the gaffs on your Bashlin climbers, you will need the following items: a vise with blocking to hold but not damage the climber shanks, a 6-inch mill file, a honing stone, and a Bashlin No. 5 gaff gauge. This gauge is only for Bashlin pole gaffs. It is not to be used on tree gaffs. Do not use another manufacturer's gaff gauge on Bashlin gaffs, as the dimensions of their gaff and gaff gauges are different. The file, stone, and gaff gauge are all included in the Bashlin No. 27 gaff shaping kit. Before we go any further, we must mention the fact that any device that can cause the hardened gaffs to lose their temper should not be used, so don't use a grinder on your gaffs. To sharpen your Bashlin gaffs, begin by placing the climber in a vise. Use wood blocks to protect the shank. It should be positioned in the vise with the underside of the gaff up. Using 2 hands to grasp the mill file, place it against the ridge on the underside of the gaff. In a smooth motion, pull the file toward you and roll it over the tip of the gaff. Keep the file flat so that both edges of the gaff are sharpened at the same time. Rolling it over the tip maintains the chisel point and keeps the tip of the gaff sharp. File the gaff just enough to sharpen the edges and the tip. If you prefer, repeat the procedure with the honing stone for extra sharp gaffs. After sharpening, the gaff dimensions and profile should be checked using the Bashlin No. 5 gaff gauge, and the gaff should be tested before returning it to service. We will begin by discussing how to use the gaff gauge, how to shape a gaff, and finish with a couple of time-tested methods for checking your work. To check the length of the gaff, place the end of the gauge against the ridge on the underside of the gaff. The tip of the gaff should extend across the last line, indicating the gaff is at least 1¼ inches long. If it does not cross the line, the gaff is too short and should be removed from service. If the gaff is long enough, we will go on to use the gaff gauge to verify the thickness and width of the gaff is correct. It is best to move from one side of the gauge to the other. We will go from left to right, beginning with the area marked with a T. Place the gaff in the larger opening of the T section. Keep the gaff flat on the gauge for an accurate measurement. We are now measuring the thickness of the gaff roughly 1 inch from the tip of the gaff. If the thickness is correct, the tip of the gaff will fall between the edge of the gaff gauge and the first line. If it is too short, the gaff can be reshaped. If the gaff extends over the edge, the gaff is too thin and must be removed from service. We will explain how to shape the gaff after we finish explaining how to use the gaff gauge. Place the gaff in the small opening of the T section. This measures the thickness of the gaff, roughly 1/2 inch from the tip. The tip of the gaff should fall between the 2 lines running down the center of the gaff gauge. If the tip of the gaff extends past the furthest line, remove it from service. If it falls short of the first line, the gaff can be reshaped. Now move the gaff into the area marked with a W. The procedure is the same as the section marked with the T. Remember to keep the gaff flat on the gauge for correct measurement. Place the gaff in the larger hole. The tip should fall between the edge of the gaff gauge and the first line. If it falls short, it should be reshaped. If it crosses the edge of the gaff gauge, it's too thin and should be removed from service. Repeat the procedure with a smaller hole. If we have determined that the gaff is too wide and must be reshaped, put the climber back into the vise, only now with the ridge of the gaff up. Using rounded, not flat cuts, remove just enough steel to correct the profile of the gaff according to the gauge. Do not file the ridge on the back of the gaff. If the gaff is too thick, place the climber in the vise as if we were sharpening the edges and use the same motion we used to sharpen the gaff. Remove just enough metal to correct the taper, but do not slide the file over the tip. Verify the taper is correct with the gaff gauge. Now that we have verified or corrected the taper of the gaff, we will take a look at the tip of the gaff. There is a small notch or cutout in the gaff gauge. Insert the tip of the gaff into the notch. The gaff should approximate the shape of the notch. This indicates there is a rounded or chisel point that will cut into the pole. The tip should be very sharp and not rounded off. If this profile is not correct, go back to the sharpening method we used at the beginning to reshape the tip of the gaff. Finally, Place the tip of the gaff into the small hole. This can be done on either side. If the tip pokes through and can be felt, it's too thin and should be removed from service. After you have determined the gaff is the correct shape and have sharpened it to your satisfaction, it should be tested before returning it to service. There are two common gaff tests. A pair of leather gloves should be worn when performing either one. The first simply requires jabbing the gaff into a soft pine board at about a 30-degree angle, then laying the shank onto the surface of the wood and pushing the gaff across the board. This duplicates the worst possible angle the gaff would see in use. If the gaff is properly shaped, it will continue to cut into the board. If it cuts out, check the profile, then shape or resharpen and retest as needed. The second and more popular test is done on a pole. Place your foot into the stirrup of the climber and lightly jab the gaff into the pole at about a 30-degree angle, about a foot off the ground. Hold onto the pole with your free hand, and with the other hand hold the shank against the pole and step down. A properly shaped gaff will cut into the pole in 2 inches or less. Confident and safe climbing begins with good climbing technique and well-maintained equipment. It is the first and most important step in reducing the risk of falls from poles. We thank you for using Bashlin products. If there are questions, please contact us.